I had almost finished this sermon when my daughter, Gabby, 3,000 miles away in New York, texted me to ask whether I had started to write a Prince Philip prayer. Immersed in other things, I confess I hadn't seen the news to learn that the Queen's husband had sadly died at Windsor Castle this morning at the age of 99. Our Torah portion this week is partly about death. Two of the sons of Aaron the high priest, the equivalent of an ancient form of royalty, who die suddenly while offering strange fire in the sanctuary. Death, sacrificial worship, and the dietary laws. These are three of the subjects that occur in Parashat Shemini. And I hope you will forgive me if, while paying tribute to and remembering the Queen's consort, I focus instead on the subject of food, a rather odd subject for someone who professes little interest in food and cooking, even as a cultural signifier. Claudia Roden, whose beautiful book of Jewish food is more than a collection of recipes, begins with the story of her own roots, the sounds, sights, and aromas of cosmopolitan Cairo in which she grew up, and the kitchens of her mother and grandmothers. The smell of sizzling garlic, as she puts it, and crushed coriander seeds, or of rosewater in a pudding, that travelled to London after the family left Egypt. She describes the labour-intensive cooking of her Aleppo-born grandparents, where Syrian cuisine was considered the pearl of the Arab kitchen, refined and delicate. While the men went out to work, the women prided themselves on their skills. They cooked in company, she writes, and that was part of the fun. They filled chickens with meat and pine nuts, stuffed lamb with rice, rolled vine leaves, and filled pastries with mashed dates. Festivals were important occasions. They went on for days, and depending on the time of day, sweetmeats and pastries of mezze were passed around. Roden describes the huge quantities of food that were prepared, how housewives joined forces and brought their cooks, and even engaged itinerant cooks who specialized in certain dishes. Food for Claudia Roden is about history and culture, the intersection of Sephardi and Ashkenazi communities through their cuisine. It reflects the stories of families and their migrations, local produce and customs. It's about friendships and social interactions. For Rabbi Lionel Blue, another well-known cook, raised with the aromas of his mother and grandmother's cooking, food provided a framework for a theology of eating. On his relationship with God, he writes this: if you are a Jew, you will have to rearrange your kitchen, for example. It is not easy sharing a kitchen with anybody, and it is even less easy sharing yourself with another being. After the first rapture, there is the adjustment period when you both have to learn to live together. It can be very irritating. You would like a ham rasher or a battery chicken, and he, capital H, says he could not stand it. If the love and commitment are strong, you can overcome the gap, and like many couples, you will gradually get more alike, and one day you may fuse together. Brought up in a faithfully observant home, meat and milk dishes were kept separate in accordance with Jewish tradition. But when the war came, he writes, it blew the milk into the meat, and everything was forbidden. The bomb deconsecrated our kitchen and set our lives in a trajectory which led us outside tradition and outside God, though we still didn't touch rabbit. A significant influence on the way synagogues offered hospitality through serving food and in other ways is a book written by Dr. Ron Wolfson, an American writer and teacher on Jewish spirituality. The spirituality of welcoming draws on the model of Abraham and Sarah and their hospitality to 3 visitors who come to announce that Sarah will have a child the following year. Abraham offers generous provision of meat, curds, and milk in the days before meat and milk were kept separate. It is from this text that the mitzvah of hachnasat orchim, welcoming guests, hospitality, is derived. Wolfson writes about serving and feeding others, actions, he says, which embody the value of generosity of spirit, of sharing what we have, of caring for others when they are in need. The spirituality of welcoming, he says, begins with radical hospitality that brings people closer to each other, to community, to Judaism, and to God. Meeting in homes, clubs, coffee shops, often over a communal meal, is an important way of serving members and guests within our communities. And I think we all know what it is like to be seated at a table next to a stranger and to enter a conversation that might simply start with, "Please, could you pass the salt?" Part of our sadness over the past year has been the complete closing down of all hospitality, whether in the public or private spheres, and the even greater distance that shielding or keeping away from supermarkets and shops has created between us and choosing what we eat. Many of us now make our choices from pictures on a screen, and our food is delivered to our door. If we knew little about the growth and manufacture of our food, where it comes from, who is involved in its creation before the pandemic, we know even less now. I wonder if we know how much of our food is produced with the purpose simply of reducing cost, for convenience, or to increase supply for human consumption, without attention to the integrity or sanctity of a living creature or the earth from which our food comes. Kashrut are Jewish dietary laws as expressed in this week's Torah portion, also in Deuteronomy, and in the Talmud, were rooted in an understanding, partly, of ritual purity and impurity. These laws belong to a category known as chukim, statutes, for which no rationale is given. For many Jews today, Kashrut has become a signifier of identity, of loyalty to Judaism, and a mark of our distinctiveness as a people. And when you take away the right to practice those laws, as has happened with shechita in some European and Baltic countries, the right to religious freedom is removed, and this can present a painful challenge to some Jewish communities. For liberal Jews, I think the principle of kashrut, of eating what is kasher, what is appropriate and fit, needs to go further than being a symbol of our identity or obedience to the Torah. How have the plants and vegetables we eat been grown? Are we content with the commodification of food that is produced behind a vast veil of ignorance in our global economy? Are we not worried about the industrialization of food processes that cause major public health crises and the human and economic costs that arise from them? I don't even want to touch upon the dangers of another pandemic or diseases that might originate in certain animals or are caused by our encroachment on wild habitats. This is where a theology of food or eating can play a part in our liberal Jewish philosophy. If we roll our scroll all the way back to the beginning of Bereshit, of Genesis, we read that God created everything, plants, vegetation, living creatures, true to its own type, with its own integrity. God gives all seed-bearing plants and fruit to human beings to eat. And it isn't until Noah emerges from the ark that flesh, without its lifeblood, is permitted to human beings. Creating a theology of eating, of considering the integrity of the earth and the things we eat, whether creatures or plants or fruit, is vital. A theology of food requires us to be aware of what we are eating, where it comes from, and how we eat. It requires us to frame food and eating within a robust moral framework of ensuring that the human and earthly cost to our eating is not a violation of human rights, of cruelty to animals, or environmental well-being. And from this moral framework emerges our responsibility to others, to those who are hungry. On a very simple theological level, at the very beginning of the creation story, God gives us food, and human beings, created in the image of God, are required to feed the hungry and share our bread with those in need. I think it will still be some time before we are able to practice the art of hospitality, feeding and serving each other here in the synagogue. But there are other ways to be a welcoming and hospitable community, sharing our worship, sharing conversations, making each other comfortable in each other's presence, and ensuring that all those who want to be spiritually nourished by liberal Judaism are watered at the fountain of faith and knowledge of our people and their history for a good and long life. Amen.